The great hall of the Galactic Concord stretched for miles in every direction, its walls made of living crystal that hummed with the voices of 1,000 civilizations. And at its center stood the representatives of 12 ancient species, who had ruled the galaxy for 11 million years. Ambassador Yellen Vasquez of Earth stood among them, a small figure in a dark uniform, watching the holographic map that floated above the assembly like a dying star. And she felt the weight of history pressing down upon her shoulders as the HFY, prepared to speak. The HFY were not like other beings, for they existed as patterns of crystalline light that shifted and reformed with each thought. And they had guided the Concord since before Earth's sun had finished forming. And their word was absolute law across 3 spiral arms of the galaxy. The phenomenon designated Void Tide has entered the Orion Spur, the lead HFY announced, its voice resonating through the chamber like thunder through mountains. And our calculations indicate total extinction of all life within the affected zone within 6 standard months. The map shifted and 4,000 worlds suddenly glowed red, each one home to billions of living beings. And Vasquez watched as the names scrolled past her vision faster than she could read them. Velith Prime, with its endless oceans and gentle aquatic people who sang songs older than human civilization. Kryn Stellar, with its frozen cities and brilliant scientists who had unlocked secrets of physics that humans were only beginning to understand. Masari Garden, with its forest that stretched across entire continents and its people who drew life from starlight itself, all of them condemned to die. The cost of evacuation and defense has been calculated. The HFY continued without emotion, and the resources required exceed acceptable parameters by a factor of 700. Therefore, the Concord will implement strategic abandonment protocol and all assets will be withdrawn from the affected zone immediately. A murmur ran through the assembly, but it was not a murmur of protest, for the other species had learned long ago that the HFY did not make mistakes in their calculations. And if they said the cost was too high, then the cost was too high. And that was simply the way of things. Vasquez felt her hands trembling at her sides as she watched the representatives of the condemned species bow their heads in acceptance. And she wondered how they could simply accept death for billions of their own people without even raising their voices in objection. A Velith ambassador, her blue skin shimmering with barely contained grief, turned to face the assembly and spoke in a voice that did not waver despite everything. We thank the Concord for the years of protection we have enjoyed, and we accept this judgment with grace. For we understand the mathematics of survival must sometimes be cruel. Vasquez wanted to scream at her, wanted to shake her and demand to know how she could be so calm when her entire species faced extinction. But she held her tongue and waited for her own name to be called. The human delegation may remain, the HFY announced. As Earth lies outside the affected zone and faces no immediate threat from the void tide phenomenon, for a moment Vasquez said nothing. And in that silence, she thought about everything humanity had endured to reach this point. The wars and famines and near-extinction events that had forged her species into something that refused to surrender even when surrender was the logical choice. She thought about her grandmother who had survived the Pacific collapse by carrying her neighbors to higher ground one by one until her legs gave out. And she thought about her father who had volunteered for the Mars terraforming mission knowing he would never live to see grass grow on that red world. And she thought about every human who had ever looked at impossible odds and decided to try anyway. No, she said. And her voice was quiet, but it carried through the vast chamber like a knife through silk. The HFY turned to face her, their crystalline forms flickering with something that might have been confusion. Clarify your statement, Ambassador Vasquez. I said no, Vasquez repeated, and this time her voice was stronger. Humanity rejects this judgment. and we refuse to abandon 4,000 worlds to extinction while we sit safe in our own system. The silence that followed was unlike anything the Concorde had ever experienced. For 11 million years, no species had ever defied an foreign decree, and the representatives stared at the human ambassador as if she had suddenly grown wings and begun breathing fire. "This is not a negotiation," the foreign said slowly. "The mathematics are absolute, and the decision has been made." Vasquez smiled. And it was not a friendly smile. "Then humanity will make its own decision. And our decision is to help whether you approve or not." She activated her personal communicator and transmitted a single coded message to Earth. And within seconds, she received confirmation that the message had been received and understood. And she knew that across the solar system human ships were already beginning to move. "The United Terran Fleet is mobilizing," she announced to the assembly. "And within 72 hours, every ship we have will be heading into the condemned zone to begin evacuation operations. And we will not stop until every being who wants to leave has been given that chance." The Ethveran flickered rapidly, their forms destabilizing in what Vasquez realized was genuine shock. "This action is futile, Ambassador. You do not have the resources to evacuate 4 billion beings. You do not have the ships or supplies or the time. And you will only succeed in adding your own species to the death toll." "Maybe," Vasquez admitted. "But we are going to try anyway, because that is what humans do when others are suffering. We do not calculate the odds of success before deciding whether to help. We simply help and figure out the details later." She turned to face the condemned species. The Valith and the Kryn and the Masari and all the others who had accepted their deaths with such quiet dignity. And she spoke to them directly. "We are coming for you, all of you. And we will not stop until you are safe or until we have nothing left to give. This is our promise to you." The Velith ambassador stared at her with eyes that glistened with tears. She had been trying so hard to hold back. "Why would you do this for us? We are strangers to you. We have nothing to offer in return." Vasquez shrugged. "You needed help, and we can help. That is reason enough for us." As she turned and walked out of the great hall, Vasquez heard the Ethveran speaking behind her in tones of genuine bewilderment, trying to understand how any species could choose certain death over safe survival. And she smiled because she knew they would never understand humanity was coming. And the mathematics of cold calculation were about to meet something they had never accounted for. They were about to meet hope. Admiral Chen Wei-Lin stood on the bridge of the UTS Defiance and watched his fleet cross into the condemned zone. 200 warships and 3,000 civilian transports carrying everything humanity could spare. And behind them, Earth grew smaller and smaller, until it was just another point of light among millions. The Ethveran had been true to their word and had cut off all Concorde resources the moment the human fleet departed, which meant no resupply stations, no communication relays, no reinforcements if anything went wrong. And Chun knew that his people were completely alone in a region of space that had been sentenced to death. 6 months, his executive officer, Commander Park, said quietly. 6 months to evacuate 4 billion people across 4,000 worlds. The math does not work, Admiral. Chun nodded slowly. Then we will have to make it work, Commander. Because I did not bring these people out here to fail. The first rescue operations began on Velith Prime, a water world covered in vast oceans where the Velith people had built their civilization beneath the waves. And the problem started immediately, because human ships were not designed to carry aquatic beings who needed pressurized water tanks and specific mineral content and temperature ranges that human life support systems could not provide. Chief Engineer Rosa Martinez had not slept in 3 days when she finally figured out a solution, converting cargo holds into massive aquariums by welding together hull plates and running emergency water reclamation systems in reverse. And it was ugly and dangerous and violated about 50 safety regulations, but it worked. This is insane. One of her assistants muttered as they watched Velith refugees swimming into the improvised tanks. We are basically putting aliens in giant fishbowls held together with hope and welding wire. Martinez shrugged and reached for another cup of coffee. Do you have a better idea? Because if you do, I would love to hear it. Otherwise, shut up and keep welding on the frozen world of Kryn Stellar. The problems were different because the Kryn could not survive in temperatures above freezing, and human ships were kept at a comfortable 20 degrees Celsius, which would kill a Kryn within minutes of exposure. Lieutenant Commander James Okonkwo solved this by converting the ammunition storage bays of 3 destroyers into refrigerated compartments, dumping the weapons into space to make room for refugees. And when his captain demanded to know how they were supposed to defend themselves without weapons, Okonkwo simply pointed at the void-tide readings on the sensor display. Sir, with respect, we are not going to be fighting anyone. We are going to be running for our lives. And I would rather have living passengers than dead ones and a full magazine. The captain stared at him for a long moment and then nodded. Do it, Lieutenant Commander, and may God forgive us if you are wrong. Meanwhile, on Masari Garden, Commander Sophia Reyes led ground teams through cities that were slowly dying as the first effects of the approaching void tide began to reach them. And she found the Masari elders gathered in their ancient temple, refusing to leave. We have lived here for 10,000 years, the eldest of them said, a bark-like skin cracked with age and her leaves drooping with exhaustion. This is our home, and we will not abandon it to die alone. Reyes sat down beside her and was quiet for a long time. And then she began to speak about Earth, about the blue oceans and green forests that humanity had nearly destroyed through greed and carelessness, and about how her species had looked at their dying world and decided to save it instead of accepting its death. We made mistakes, Reyes admitted. Terrible mistakes that killed millions and scarred our planet for generations. But we did not give up. We fought and struggled and sacrificed, and slowly we healed what we had broken. And now Earth is more beautiful than it has been in centuries. The Masari elder listened in silence, and when Reyes finished speaking, she reached out with a gnawed hand and touched the human's face. You truly believe that survival is possible, even when all hope seems lost. I believe that giving up is the only certain way to fail, Reyes replied. And I believe that your people deserve the chance to find a new home where they can grow and thrive for another 10,000 years. By dawn, the elders were boarding the transports, and as her ship lifted off, Reyes watched the ancient forests of Masari Garden shrinking below her, and she made a silent promise that their beauty would not be forgotten back on the Defiance. Admiral Chun received reports from across the condemned zone, and what he saw was chaos. Beautiful, impossible chaos as human crews pushed themselves beyond all reasonable limits to save lives that had nothing to do with them. A Concord observer ship had been following the human fleet at a distance, watching their operations with what Chun assumed was professional curiosity. And after 3 weeks, the observer requested permission to come aboard for an interview. Chun granted it because he was too tired to argue. And he found himself facing a Kryn diplomat named Thesa, who had been assigned to document the human rescue effort for the Concord archives. I do not understand, Thesa said, as she watched exhausted human medics treating wounded refugees in corridors so crowded that people could barely move. Your supply lines are stretched impossibly thin, and your crews show signs of severe exhaustion and malnutrition. You are destroying yourselves to save us, and it makes no sense. A young medic named David Park looked up from the Velith child he was treating and managed a tired smile. Why does it have to make sense? Thesa blinked in confusion. Everything must make sense. Actions must have reasons, and reasons must have logic behind them. We are here because you needed help, Park said simply. You were going to die, and we could do something about it. That is the only reason we need. But the cost, he suppressed. The cost to your own species is enormous. You are spending resources you cannot replace to save people you have never met. People who can offer you nothing in return. Park finished treating the Velith child and handed her back to her grateful mother. And then he turned to face the Kryn diplomat with eyes that were red from lack of sleep, but still somehow full of warmth. If we let you die to save ourselves, we would not be worth saving, he said. That is something the HFY will never understand. Sometimes the value of an action cannot be measured in resources spent or lives saved. Sometimes the value is in choosing to be the kind of people who help even when it costs us everything. Thesa stared at him for a long time, and Chun watched as something shifted in her expression. Some fundamental assumption about the universe cracking and reforming into a new shape. You are all insane, she said finally. Park laughed. Maybe, but we are insane in the best possible way. As the weeks passed and the evacuation continued, more and more Concord observers began to arrive, drawn by reports of the impossible things humanity was accomplishing. And they watched in growing amazement as human ships that should have broken down kept flying, as human crews that should have collapsed kept working, as human hearts that should have given up kept hoping, and slowly, one by one, they began to believe that maybe the HFY had been wrong about the mathematics of survival. Maybe there were things more powerful than logic. Maybe there was hope. 3 months into the evacuation, and Admiral Chen Wei-lin had not slept more than 4 hours in any given day. His uniform hung loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds, and his eyes carried shadows that would never fully fade. But he kept moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant counting the lives he could not save. Half the condemned worlds had been evacuated. 2,000 planets emptied of their populations and their people scattered across. Human ships that groaned under the weight of so many souls. But the void tide had accelerated beyond all predictions, and time was running out. Chun stood in his ready room and stared at the tactical display that showed the approaching wave of destruction. A wall of antimatter storms and reality warping. Anomalies that stretched across light years and consumed everything in its path. And he knew with terrible certainty that they could not save everyone. Sir, Commander Park said quietly from the doorway. The updated projections have arrived. Chun did not turn around. How bad? 12 worlds, sir. 12 worlds that we cannot reach in time. If we divert ships to attempt rescue, we lose 17 other worlds that we can still save. The mathematics of cold survival. The same calculations that the HFY had made months ago. And now Chun understood why they had made the choices they did. Because when the numbers were laid out in front of you, the answer seemed obvious and unavoidable. Save the many or save the few. There was no third option. Chun recorded a message to be transmitted to the 12 worlds they were abandoning. And his voice cracked as he spoke words that felt like broken glass in his throat. An apology that could never be enough. A promise that their names would be remembered. A vow that humanity would carry their stories to the stars, even if they could not carry their people to safety. But Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka had not given up. Because giving up was not something that came naturally to humans, and she had been working with a team of physicists and Masari engineers on an idea so crazy that no one had taken it seriously until now. Sir, she said, when she finally got an audience with the Admiral, I think we can weaponize the void tide. Chun stared at her as if she had grown a second head. Explain. The void tide is not a natural phenomenon, sir. Our analysis shows that it was triggered by an ancient weapon left over from a war that predates even the HFY. And like all weapons, it has a weakness. She pulled up a holographic display that showed the structure of the void tide in detail. Layer upon layer of antimatter storms wrapped around a core of destabilized spacetime. If we can detonate a precisely calibrated antimatter charge at the leading edge of the phenomenon, we might be able to destabilize its expansion. Not stop it entirely, but fracture it into smaller streams that move more slowly. Might, Chun repeated. You said might. The calculations are not certain, sir. There are too many variables, but the Masari engineers have confirmed that the theory is sound and they believe it has a reasonable chance of success. Chun looked at the display and then back at Tanaka. What is the catch, Lieutenant? Because there's always a catch. Tanaka's expression did not change, but something in her eyes grew heavier. The detonation must occur inside the void tide itself, sir. A ship would have to fly directly into the phenomenon and trigger the charge manually. Navigation systems will not function inside the anomaly and remote. Detonation is impossible. You are describing a suicide mission. Yes, sir. Chung closed his eyes and for a moment he was back on Earth, standing in the garden his grandmother had planted. Watching her hands move through the soil as she explained that some things were worth dying, for even if you did not know exactly what those things were, you just knew them in your heart when the moment came. How many volunteers? He asked. 417, sir. The request went out an hour ago. 400 human beings willing to fly into certain death for the chance to save 12 worlds full of strangers. And Chum felt something that might have been pride or might have been grief or might have been both at once. He selected Captain Marcus Cole for the mission. A man whose file showed no family and no close attachments. A man who had spent his career taking the jobs that no one else wanted because he had nothing to lose. But in the 3 months of evacuation operations, Cole had changed in ways that his file did not reflect. Chun had seen it happen to others. The way that fighting for something larger than yourself could fill the empty spaces inside you. And he knew that Cole was no longer the man he had been when this mission began. Captain Cole, Chum said when the man stood before him. You understand what you are being asked to do? Cole nodded slowly. I understand, Admiral, and I want you to know that I'm not doing this because I have nothing to live for. I am doing this because I have finally found something worth dying for. The UTS Prometheus launched 12 hours later with Cole at the helm and a skeleton crew of volunteers who had refused to let him go alone. And the entire fleet watched as the small ship accelerated toward the wall of destruction that filled their sensors with static and screaming light. Cole's final transmission came just before he crossed the threshold, his voice calm and clear despite everything. Admiral Chun, tell them we did not look away. Tell them that when the universe asked humanity to choose between safety and mercy, we chose mercy every single time. Then the Prometheus was gone, swallowed by the void tide, and for 17 terrible seconds, there was nothing but silence. The detonation lit up sensors across 3 systems. A flash of light so bright that it overwhelmed instruments designed to stare directly at suns. And when the readings cleared, the void tide had fractured exactly as Tanaka predicted, splitting into a dozen smaller streams that were already beginning to slow. The 12 doomed worlds now had time. Time for human ships to reach them. Time for evacuation operations to succeed. Time for 400 million people who had been sentenced to death to live. Captain Marcus Cole and his crew became the first names inscribed on a monument that would eventually hold 4,000 human dead. And on every world that was saved by their sacrifice, those names were spoken with reverence that bordered on worship. But the work was not finished because the void tide fragments were still coming, and there were still billions of people who needed rescue. So the human fleet mourned their dead for exactly 1 hour, and then returned to the impossible task that they had chosen to accept. Admiral Chun stood on the bridge of the Defiance and watched his exhausted crews throw themselves back into the chaos of evacuation operations. And he wondered if the Ethveron could see what was happening here, if they understood yet that their mathematics had failed to account for the most important variable of all. The human heart did not calculate the odds before deciding to help. It simply helped and trusted that somehow, someway the universe would find a way to make things right. And sometimes against all odds, the universe actually did. The evacuation was complete and 4 billion souls had been saved from the void tide. Scattered across human ships and temporary shelters and refugee camps that stretched from Earth to the outer colonies. And the galaxy watched in stunned silence as the impossible became reality. Ambassador Yellen Vasquez received the summons 3 days after the last transport crossed out of the condemned zone. A message from the HFY requesting her presence on their homeworld. A place that no non-Overlord had ever seen in the entire 11 million year history of the Galactic Concord. She went alone because that was what the summons specified. Her small ship crossing through regions of space that were not marked on any human star chart, guided by coordinates that her navigation computer could barely process. Until she arrived at a world that burned with the light of 1,000 captured stars. The HFY homeworld was not a planet in any normal sense. It was a construct of pure energy and crystallized thought that floated in a bubble of stabilized spacetime. And as Vasquez stepped out of her ship, she felt the weight of ages pressing down on her like the gravity of a dying sun. The HFY were waiting for her. Hundreds of them gathered in a vast amphitheater that seemed to stretch into infinity. Their crystalline forms flickering with colors that human eyes were not designed to perceive. And at their center sat the oldest of them all, a being whose light had dimmed with age until it was barely visible against the darkness. Ambassador Vasquez, the Ancient One, spoke, and its voice carried harmonics that made her bones vibrate and her teeth ache. "You have been summoned to explain the actions of your species." Vasquez stood straight and met what she assumed were its eyes. "I am here to answer your questions. Our calculations were precise," the HFY said. "The resources required to evacuate the condemned zone exceeded acceptable parameters by a factor of 700. The probability of success was less than 1%, and yet humanity succeeded." "Explain how this is possible." Vasquez thought about all the things she could say. The technical details of improvised engineering and desperate innovation. The statistics of ships deployed and refugees saved and lives lost in the process. But she knew that none of those answers would satisfy beings who had spent 11 million years perfecting the mathematics of survival. "You calculated lives against resources," she said finally. "You measured survival against cost, and your mathematics were perfect. Every variable accounted for, every outcome predicted. But you forgot something." The HFY flickered with what might have been curiosity or might have been irritation. "What did we forget?" "You forgot that some species do not calculate when others are dying," Vasquez replied. "You forgot that humans do not measure the value of a life against the cost of saving it. We just move. We see suffering and we act. Not because the numbers add up, but because the numbers do not matter." The ancient HFY leaned forward, its dim light brightening slightly with interest. "This is illogical. All actions must be weighed against their costs. All decisions must be made through calculation. This is the foundation of rational existence." "Maybe for you," Vasquez agreed. "But humanity has never been particularly rational. We are a species that climbed down from trees and decided to walk across continents because we wondered what was on the other side. We are a species that looked at the stars and decided to reach for them even though the distances were impossible. We are a species that refuses to accept that anything is truly impossible if we want it badly enough." She paused and looked around at the assembled HFY. Beings older than her entire species. Beings who had watched civilizations rise and fall like waves on a shore. And she felt no fear because she had already seen what humanity was capable of when it chose to care. "You asked how we succeeded," she continued. "The answer is simple. We succeeded because we refused to accept failure. Every time the mathematics said we could not save another ship, we found a way to save it anyway. Every time the calculations said we had reached our limits, we pushed past those limits. We broke ourselves trying to save strangers, and somehow in the breaking we became stronger. The ancient HFY was silent for a long time, and Vasquez could feel the weight of its attention pressing against her mind like fingers probing the edges of her thoughts. 4,000 of your people died, it said finally. 4,000 humans who would still be alive if you had accepted our judgment and remained in your own system. How do you justify this loss? Vasquez smiled, and it was not a sad smile, but a proud one. I do not need to justify it because those 4,000 people made their own choice. They knew the risks, and they went anyway because they believed that some things are worth dying for. They believed that mercy is more important than survival and compassion is more valuable than calculation. This is inefficient. The HFY declared. Yes, Vasquez agreed. And 4 billion people are alive because of it. 4 billion people who will remember what humanity did for them. 4 billion people who will tell their children and their children's children that when the universe abandoned them, one small species from an unremarkable star decided to save them. Anyway, she stepped forward and her voice grew stronger. Your mathematics failed because they did not account for something that cannot be measured. They did not account for love, not romantic love, but something larger. The love that drives a stranger to run into a burning building to save someone they have never met. The love that makes a soldier throw themselves on a grenade to protect their comrades. The love that convinced 400 human beings to fly into certain death so that 12 worlds could live. The HFY assembly rippled with something that looked like confusion, their forms destabilizing and reforming as they processed. Concepts that their ancient minds had never been designed to understand, and beyond the amphitheater, beyond the HFY and homeworld, beyond the boundaries of Concord space. The species that humanity had saved were watching this confrontation unfold through channels that the Overlords did not know existed. And they were beginning to talk among themselves about a new kind of alliance, the Velith, who had been abandoned by their protectors and saved by strangers. The Kryn, whose cold logic had been warmed by human compassion. The Masari, whose ancient forests had been lost, but whose people had been given a chance to plant new seeds on new worlds. All of them were watching, and all of them were choosing. You have disrupted the order of the galaxy, the ancient HFY said. And there was something in its voice that might have been anger or might have been fear. The Concord has maintained stability for 11 million years, and your actions have introduced chaos into systems that were perfectly balanced. Vasquez nodded slowly. Yes, we have, and we are not sorry, because your perfect balance was built on the bodies of those you deemed too expensive to save. Your stability was purchased with the lives of the innocent, and humanity refuses to accept that kind of peace. She turned and began walking back to her ship, and the HFY did not stop her. And as she climbed into the cockpit, she heard the Ancient One speak one final time. You do not understand what you have done, human. You do not understand the forces you have set in motion. Vasquez looked back at the assembled Overlords, beings who had ruled the galaxy since before her species existed. Beings whose power was beyond anything humanity could hope to match. And she smiled. Maybe not, she admitted. But I understand what we chose to do, and I understand why we chose to do it. And that is enough for me. Her ship rose into the sky and left the HFY and homeworld behind. And as she crossed back into charted space, she received a message from Admiral Chun informing her that 17 species had already requested formal alliances with humanity. The galaxy was changing, and the mathematics of cold survival were beginning to crack. And at the center of it all stood a small species from an unremarkable star who had simply refused to look away when others were suffering. 1 year had passed since the void tide, and the galaxy was no longer the same place it had been when humanity first defied the HFY. The old order was cracking, and something new was being born from the fractures. something that the ancient overlords had never predicted and could not control. Admiral Chen Wei-lin stood on the observation deck of the new space station that orbited the first of the resettlement worlds, watching construction ships move like fireflies against the darkness, building homes for refugees who had chosen to live near the species that saved them. He was thinner than he had been before the evacuation, and his hair had gone completely gray in the past 12 months. But his eyes still held the same quiet determination that had driven him across the condemned zone when everyone said the mission was impossible. "Admiral," Commander Park said as she approached with a data tablet in her hands. "The latest census numbers have arrived." Chun took the tablet and studied the figures. 4 billion refugees now resettled across 200 worlds, each colony positioned within easy travel distance of human space. Each one built with a mixture of human technology and native expertise that created something entirely new. The Velith had chosen a world with vast oceans where they could build their underwater cities alongside human coastal settlements. And already the two species were developing trade agreements and cultural exchange programs that neither had imagined possible before the evacuation. The Krim had selected a frozen moon where they could maintain their preferred temperatures, while human engineers helped them construct orbital habitats that would allow for easier contact with warmer species. And their scientists were already collaborating with human physicists on projects that pushed the boundaries of known science. The Masari had found a world with rich soil and abundant sunlight, where they could plant the seeds they had brought from their dying homeworld. And human botanists worked beside them learning secrets of plant cultivation that had been developed over 10,000 years of symbiotic existence. But it was not just the rescued species who had been changed by the evacuation. Humanity itself was different now, transformed by the experience of fighting alongside strangers for a cause that offered no reward except the knowledge that they had done the right thing. Monuments had risen on every human world bearing the names of the 4,000 who had died during the evacuation. Stone and metal and light arranged in patterns that told the story of sacrifice and salvation. And on 4,000 alien worlds, those same names were carved into temples and some in languages that humanity was only beginning to learn. Captain Marcus Cole had become something more than a hero. His name was spoken in prayers, and his story was told to children as an example of what it meant to be truly brave. And the Prometheus had been reconstructed from salvaged debris and placed in a museum where visitors from 100 species came to pay their respects. "Sir," Park said quietly, "the new compact assembly is about to begin." Chun nodded and made his way to the central chamber of the station, where representatives from 37 species had gathered. Not the ancient species of the Concord, but the young and the struggling and the forgotten. All of them bound together by a single memory and a single promise. Ambassador Vasquez stood at the podium, her dark hair now streaked with silver, and her face marked with lines that had not been there a year ago. But her voice was as strong as ever as she addressed the assembly. "1 year ago, the Ethvorin called us inefficient," she began. "They said that our refusal to calculate the value of lives against the cost of saving them was irrational and wasteful. They said that our compassion was a weakness that would destroy us." She paused and looked around the chamber at the faces of beings who had once been strangers and were now something closer to family. "They were right about one thing. We are inefficient. We spend resources we cannot spare, and we risk lives on impossible odds, and we refuse to do the math when the math says to let people die." The chamber was completely silent as she continued. "But they were wrong about everything else, because our inefficiency is not a weakness. It is our greatest strength. It is the thing that brought us together when the galaxy tried to tear us apart. And it is the thing that will carry us forward into a future that none of us could have imagined alone." She raised her hand and the holographic display behind her lit up with images of the new colony worlds. Cities rising from empty plains and ships crossing between stars that had once been separated by politics and fear. And over all of it, the symbol of the new compact. A circle of hands, clasping hands that represented the promise they had made to each other. The Galactic Compact is built on calculation, Vasquez said. It is built on the mathematics of cold survival that say some lives are worth more than others, and some species deserve to live while others deserve to die. But this new compact is built on something different. It is built on a simple promise that we will never abandon each other, no matter the cost. She turned to face the Concord observers, who had been permitted to attend. Representatives of the HFY who watched with expressions that were impossible to read. And she spoke directly to them. You have ruled this galaxy for 11 million years, and in that time, you have maintained order through calculation and control. But your order was built on the suffering of those you deemed expendable, and that order is ending now. Not because we are stronger than you, but because we have shown the galaxy that there is another way. The assembly rose as one. 37 species standing together in a display of unity that the HFY had believed impossible. And the sound of their voices raised in affirmation echoed through the chamber like thunder. Later that night, Chun found himself standing, alone on the observation deck, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, and he thought about everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. The HFY would not simply accept the loss of their authority. He knew that, and the conflicts ahead would be difficult and costly. But for the first time in his life, he believed that humanity was fighting for something truly worth defending. A small figure approached, and he turned to find a Velith child standing beside him, her blue skin shimmering in the starlight, and she reached up with one webbed hand and tugged at his sleeve. Admiral Chun, she said in careful English. My mother sent me to give you this. She pressed something into his hand, and when he looked down, he saw a small crystal that pulsed with inner light. A Velith memory stone that contained the recorded thoughts and feelings of its creator. She says it is the story of our rescue, the child explained. She says she wants you to know what it felt like when your ships appeared in our sky. She says she wants you to understand what hope looks like to people who had given up on ever seeing it again. Chum knelt down so that he was at eye level with the child, and he felt tears forming in his eyes that he did not try to hide. Thank you. This means more to me than you can possibly know. The child smiled, and it was a smile that transcended species and language and culture. A smile that said everything that needed to be said about what had been built between their peoples. My mother also taught me an English word, she said. She says it is the most important word your language has. She says it is the word that means everything. What word is that? Chun asked. The child reached out and took his hand in both of hers, her webbed fingers warm against his skin. And she spoke the word with perfect clarity and absolute certainty. Friend? And in that moment, Chun understood that everything they had done, all the sacrifice and suffering and loss, had been worth it because they had not just saved lives. They had changed the galaxy. They had proven that compassion was stronger than calculation and mercy was more powerful than mathematics. The Thavaran watched from their ancient world, and for the first time in 11 million years, they were uncertain of the future, because the small species from the unremarkable star had shown the universe something that their calculations could never have predicted. They had shown the universe what it looked like when humanity refused to look away, and the universe would never be the same again.